Hi, welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations with Andre and Kjessie with
Hello.
Multicultural Family Hub. And today we're going to talk about culture. So that's what we do.
Yeah, Chessie and I were talking and we were trying to think of some examples in our individual lives, but then our relationship journey where culture really had a big influence on how we saw things either the same or differently. So one of the things that came up that was really obvious, especially as we're stepping into an entrepreneurial space as a family, is jobs. So we want to talk about our cultures and how they relate to our view on jobs or entrepreneurial work.
Yeah, like how you make a living. And I, the story I was given growing up, I grew up in like a very education focused family culture.
Mhm.
And so the best thing you could do was like get the A's, get into a good college, and like the more education, the better. And that education would get you a good job, and then you stay in that job for security. And you like find a good job, and then you just like move in that lane. Um, and so that was like the story that I was given. And I recognize now, kind of having moved through a couple entrepreneurial journeys, that that is just not who I am. And so having this culture, I felt a lot of shame because my resume was crazy.
Mhm.
Like it still is, I should say, it is crazy. It has so many different jobs, like double digit, and I'm so interested in different things. And I would like kind of get to mastery in something and be like, okay, next thing. And the story I was given of how a resume should look
Mhm.
is that you should have a few things and you should stay in it for a long time because otherwise you look flaky. And that so you get this job, then you stay there, and that shows that you are committed. And
Mhm.
this is like the way that you have like safe, successful life. So that was like the story that I was given.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, and I come from a culture where I would say the primary influencers or the people I around were a lot of folks that were had immigrated to the United States. My mom is from Jamaica, and so a lot of her friends come from all over the world, but a lot of folks that come from the Caribbean, and just different places. And so it really I had an interesting exposure to work and jobs and entrepreneurship because I grew up with around highly educated people, but most of them were doing jobs that were outside of their formal education. So I knew people that had a social work background that were involved in banking, or I knew people that were had an engineering background and they may be running a bakery. And what's interesting when I think about my life and I think about a lot of the women that I was influenced by throughout my childhood and growing up, most of them at different periods of my life had different jobs. And it was for different reasons. It wasn't necessarily like they were trying to excel up a ladder. It was because either times had changed or the industry they were in had changed. Then maybe that job was no longer there. And so they switched, or their kids were of a certain age and they needed to be able to pick them up or take them to different things. And so they would stop doing one job and switch to another. And a lot of times it was also based on the relationships. Like a friend would say, "Hey, girl, there's this job at H&R Block, and you're really good with numbers because you worked at the bank." And that person would be like, "Oh my goodness, that's just what I'm looking for because I'm trying to transition out, and my kids are going into middle school, and I want to be able to
Have more
and have
flexibility
flexibility."
or
So I actually grew up like not knowing. I don't think I knew one person from like my childhood that had one
thank
job
God.
and had it till I became an adult. And so for me, your education was not necessarily linked to a job you were going to do forever. It was almost like those were two separate things.
Mm.
So when it comes to entrepreneurship, in some ways, I have been always around men and women who were constantly
Like creating a life.
creating a life. And sometimes that meant having a job with a salary, or sometimes that meant working under someone, and sometimes that meant I'm going to start something. And oftentimes they were doing both of these things at the same time. And so, um, that had a huge impact on my life and has allowed me not to feel so crazy with like Chessie, this resume that has done a variety of things and even continues to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I so appreciate that because I feel like I was always fearful thinking about changing jobs, like, what does this mean about me? And I grew up in the opposite community where like people stay, you did the same thing your whole life, and in some ways your identity was that thing. So changing was almost unfathomable. Or the story was like, oh, you can't leave that because there's nothing else.
Yeah.
Um, and so I am so appreciative that in our relationship, and even just talking about it right now, like just that consistent acceptance of moving forward. And we 3 years ago started a farm. So
A flower
a
farm.
flower farm. So our community went through a major tragedy. The town burned down, and it was hard, really intense. And I, in that moment, felt called to do something beautiful. And so we started this flower farm that was delivering flowers to people who had lost their homes. And I was just kind of a wreck about it. So nervous to put myself out there and so nervous to say that I like what I was creating had value. Like all of this stuff came up for me, which in some ways I feel like you just flowed with and we're like, oh no, this is normal. This is what it looks like. And I'm so thankful for like your anchor because I was so scared, but I also feel like that was the moment that I would recognize like, oh no, I am an entrepreneur and
Yeah.
am meant to create things.
Yeah.
And we are, pivoting from flower farming to multicultural family hub, and it feels so good. And in some ways, it's because of the culture that you came from, saying like, "Oh no, this is normal. This is part of my story."
Mhm.
And that is also the beauty of multicultural families, because if I had been with someone with a similar story, I don't think I could have broken out on my own.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. And one of the terms you'll hear me use a lot is the term overculture. And so, Chessie's right. My immediate culture I grew up around were these people that were multi-passionate, seeing opportunity, creating opportunity. However, there was still an overculture
Right.
of being a male who was raised in the South, and there still was an overculture of like your primary role in a relationship is security and stability
To provide.
to provide. So during that time in our transition, I was working in education, which, for a lot of people, depending on where you are, different things, it's one of them can be one of the more secure jobs. But with the fire and with everything that happened, that changed that landscape. And so I would be lying if I said I easily just pivoted to we are flower farming entrepreneurs, because in the back of my mind was still that overcultural message of like,
Mhm.
of even though Jesse's incredibly educated, incredibly smart, it can do so many things, it was still like that overculture message of like, but Andre,
You're supposed
your
to.
role like is to find the stable thing while she explores that. Which, that once again, it's good to hear those messages. It's also good to catch them and also good to say, okay, where are you then not showing up because you're still letting this story that is not necessarily innate to who you are, and it wasn't how you grew up, but you were influenced by it.
Mm.
And so that is where I would say that it's been through conversations like this
Yeah.
that we've both come to this place, but we didn't really start out here.
Yeah, and there was some messy years with the flower farm piece
Yeah,
too,
yeah.
because in recognizing like in going out to get work,
Hmm.
to like which is the overculture, right? You go out to get
Yeah,
the work to bring home
yeah, yeah,
like the stable financial
yeah,
piece,
yeah,
provide in that way. That's like how a man is supposed to
yeah,
provide in like the overculture. Whereas what I needed desperately was someone physically here helping with kids,
yeah.
because we have three small children and I'd be out trying to harvest
Oh my
flowers, do all
goodness.
these things
Yeah,
with like just like overwhelmed by children.
yeah.
And so having those conversations of like, is going out and bringing in the resource more important, or is the like back end
Hmm.
actually more supportive? And like, what do we actually want our family to feel like?
Hmm.
And what kind of a culture do we want to have? And yeah,
Yeah, and I think what really got us to this point is like understanding that what do we want our relationship with work to be? And really seeing work as a relationship and also realizing at different times in our lives that's going to look different. And
yeah,
so I think once we sat down and looked at your culture and how its view was of work or jobs, and then my culture, seeing how its view work and jobs, and then looking at the over culture, you
yeah,
and I were able to sit down and go, okay, now we see all these factors, but let's sit down and draft and design and look at what do we actually want this to look like for our unique multicultural
yeah.
family.
And that it's changes.
And that changes.
And it
Yeah.
changes constantly with the phase of life that we're in. I
Mhm.
mean, when we had little babies and twins, it was just like,
We just needed bodies to
it just felt
hold
like a
things.
straight
Just
survival mode. Um, and
uh,
in some ways, it's those, I feel like the more
yeah.
support, the better in those years because it is so physically demanding. And there's things I would have done different from that
Mhm,
time period
mhm,
as well that I
mhm,
know. But I am so thankful, like right now, to be in this place to say, like, okay, like what do we want this to
mhm.
look like? And be able to identify my stories, your stories, and like Andre said, the overculture stories, and
Mhm.
pull out the things that we are no longer serving us that
Yeah.
might have been. And that's the other piece. Like these are things that might have been good
Mhm.
at one time period.
Yeah.
And like we like needed that stable school piece. We needed in those like early years,
Need that construction job.
right, needed that
Yeah.
construction job in that moment.
Mhm.
But okay, so now it's not serving us, so now what? And
Yeah.
the tools to be able to pull out all of our
Yeah.
stories that are keeping us from doing what's best.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot of fear in that too. And I feel like a lot of emotions come up. I feel like these are not easy conversations. For me, there tend to be tears because that's where I go to.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and just like allowing that release to move to the next place.
Well, and and I think the last piece of this is that when we're looking at these, things like jobs or work through a cultural lens, what's really interesting is you can see that even when you transition and make a different choice, where you're over culture, it'll still kind of creep in. Like for example, Jesse and I are
Mhm.
both entrepreneurs. So what does the workday look like? Like, do we still start at 9 and end at 5? So even with all the
Yeah.
supposed freedom, you have to be flexible and to adapt. You still have to recognize where we could easily just fall into, well, the workday, starts at 8 and ends at 5, or starts at 9 and ends at 5. And sorry, kids, we can't go for a hike, or sorry, we can't do this and we can't do that. And so that is something that we still constantly saying, oh, there it is again.
Yeah.
We can go do this and change the schedule and adapt and still show up and still work hard. And so it really is, you're constantly trying to not let those habits and that natural firing pull you back into, yeah, you're an entrepreneur, but you're really just working. You're not actually taking advantage of any of the benefits and the lifestyle pieces of what that means. And even if you're not an entrepreneur, it's like I've been in work situations where, uh, I the payment for the job I'm doing ends at 3, and culturally
Everybody
people
stays for
work
hours
till
later.
6 or 7, or you
Yeah.
drive and it's 9 o'clock and they're still there. So they're not even getting paid. But there's a culture of, well, I'll just keep doing it. And so that's a cultural piece. So those are all the things that we're constantly talking about. But as a community, we hope that we can share skills and tools to identify when that's going on.
Yeah.
And that, that kind of that cultural norms in the background that are leading us to make decisions that serve our family, or sometimes they don't serve our family. And sometimes they may actually be causing harm to our health and wellness and our relationships. So, anyway,
And it's also, I just want to say that it is not easy,
very uncomfortable.
very uncomfortable. All of these things are very uncomfortable. And that is like part of the journey. Like
Yes.
the asking, like recognizing the overculture or like recognizing the stories and then being like, okay, we're going to choose something different.
Yeah.
And I want to say, like, every time we've chosen something different, I am immediately back to an old pattern. And it
Mm.
takes a lot of practice and discomfort to say, oh
Mhm.
no, okay, no, I can't do this thing. That's
Yeah.
right. This is what I chose,
Yeah.
and we're gonna do this
Yeah.
thing. And I do feel like it
Support.
takes support.
Yeah.
And for us, we have this partnership.
Hmm.
For you, it could look like a your mom or a friend or a sister or an uncle, a
Coach.
coach, anyone that's like, hey, no, like this is where you said you wanted to go.
Yeah.
Because your body and your brain, for me specifically, my body wants to go back to the
Hmm.
thing that feels comfortable. And we all like move through it differently, but I feel like there's so many things that show up uncomfortably in my
Yeah.
body that I'm like, oh, that's right. That's what that feeling is. Like I'm trying to do something
Mhm.
different and like pushing through the discomfort to find a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you guys for taking time to listen to this. And in this one, I'd love to encourage you guys in the comment section. We'd love to hear like how has culture influenced your, I mean, how has your culture influenced your view of work or your relationship to what a job is or
Yeah.
entrepreneurship? Was there overculture that you grew up in that was different than your family culture, but shaped your relationship with work, entrepreneurship, education, and those pieces? We'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Put it in the comments, and we'd love to kind of keep having this conversation with you guys. All
Yeah,
right.
thanks for joining us. So this was our kitchen table conversations. We are going to be opening up our multicultural family hub community in June, and we hope that you will join us there and just start enjoying our
Yeah.
conversations here. And hopefully, it helps you dig a little deeper, start getting a little bit uncomfortable. And we look forward to connecting with you.
Okay. See you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.